Hello and welcome to the second, probably last installment ever of the LC podcast. Here today with Shrug.
Hi, I'm Shrug. Vullaby did not get banned, and while there's almost no way that was due to my last appearance on the LC podcast, I'm going to take credit for it anyway. I'm going to take my wins where they come. Vullaby not banned. It's because you all listened and subscribed and kind of took my words to heart, and I'm excited to be back with you dropping more metagame knowledge.
Well, I'm almost certain none of that was true. It's definitely possible there was a butterfly effect wherein you taking a 2-point infraction led to Vullaby not getting banned.
Yeah, it's the domino meme where it's like, I decide that I haven't been infracted enough recently, and then Vullaby stays in the tier.
I think I will punish myself today. So, as you said, Vullaby did not get banned. Our final vote count was 33-29 banned to do not ban, but you need a 60% threshold to get a ban. At least in LC, I don't pay attention to other tiers. So, a majority of the voter base said, get this bird out of here, but not enough. So, we're all going to have to live with the consequences, which is just fine for us because we both voted do not ban.
Yeah, so I wasn't surprised by the vote. I knew it was going to be close. I knew there was some strong pro-ban sentiment among people, whose opinions I respected, like Levi or whatever. And it was about as close as you can come. It wasn't called for a day and a half. We were kind of sweating the vote until the very end. But I think, thankfully for the tier, Vullaby stayed in, and we have our universal check and universal offensive pressure, and won't have to kind of patch together both checking everything and attacking everything out of 6 months when you really need 9 months to do that when Vullaby's gone.
Yep, Lando T / Clefable / ADV Snorlax. GSC Snorlax? I don't play those tiers either.
GSC.
DPP Munchlax. They all lived. It's a victory for the big guys. The underdogs did fail, and it's important that they feel bad. I'm kidding, but as you said, I thought it was pretty interesting how long we had to wait. There was a lot of confidence projected early in the week from Do Not Ban Party, mainly from people like Serene. The insistence that this vote was not going to be close, and it took a long time. And I said a lot of the same tired metaphors about U.S. presidential elections, but we pulled through. Bad guys did not win unless we're the bad guys, in which case we did win.
Yeah.
And now it's time for us to move on to figure out what we do to make this tier better from here, because I don't think we're going back to the Vullaby well again. Certainly not anytime soon.
Yeah, so we basically won the Electoral College while losing the popular vote, to use the most apt, tired American political metaphor of all. And now we're in a position where, well, I don't know who would be an analogous American political figure to win the popular vote or win the Electoral College and not the popular vote. This is kind of
Donald
like
Trump.
If
we're Trump, and we're epic posters, so it makes sense.
But Donald Trump doesn't kind of map onto the Vullaby. Vullaby is kind of like it would be like if George Bush, both George Bushes were combined into one figure, and they won in the 2000 election.
This is really too powerful for me to contemplate.
Yeah, okay. We don't have to get too conceptual 3 minutes into the podcast.
I don't even think I can handle concepts like that. My brain is feeble.
Yeah.
But everybody's got takes now. Of course they do, but a lot of anger, a lot of angst following the Vullaby do not ban. I think a lot of that spills over from Sun Moon, just because of how broken, I think at least, Vullaby is there, and how overdue people felt the suspect was. Just never came before the end of the tier. But we got to move on. And the question is, what do we suspect to deal with people's frustrations with the tiers? You are famously, infamously, whatever, a big proponent of doing something about cheese, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the talk of the town, the big player of the hour is Woobat, I think. This is the Woobat suspect seems to be the suspect that's gaining the most traction in pretty much any corner. I know that there's some people who are kind of conceptually opposed. I know Coconut is. I think I've seen some skepticism from other council members like Zebra, but I know that a decent number of council members support it, and a decent number of community members, both Vullaby, Do Not Ban, and Ban voters alike, are in favor of this suspect. So my question to you is, do you think that dealing with Vullaby is a sufficient answer to the question of how do we fix what's wrong with the tier? Because we all know what you think is wrong with the tier. Do you think that this goes far enough, or would it be a successful solution even if you didn't get exactly what you wanted?
So I think that banning Woobat will not solve the problem that I've identified with the tier that we're going to go into later. But I don't think it's like not a worthwhile endeavor for that fact. So part of the appeal of banning Woobat is that it's core to two of the kind of more irritating cheese setups we've seen in the past like year in Little Cup. So the famous DK Webb's team had it, if I'm remembering right, and then the kind of Serene Screens also uses Woobat in that way. So Woobat plays an important role in those teams in kind of like, it's the backstop in the chain of setup mons or whatever. So you killed the Tyrant, but you have your Timber out there. Woobat gets +2 defense. It immediately calm minds. You can't kill it. It's going to kill you. If you switch out, you're just giving it setup for free. There's essentially no check unless you're like risking Onyx ties or whatever. So I think a Woobat suspect would be justifiable on that basis. It's almost broken, like by itself, in its ability to kind of set up and then rip teams apart, especially under conditions of webs or screens. And then to compound that, it kind of makes these play styles, which are sort of very difficult for LC to counter by their nature. It makes them so much worse that I don't think I am persuaded by the case that Woobat by itself would be a good suspect. Would it be the thing I do first? I'm not convinced about that, but that kind of relates more to like my other beliefs on like what the tier should be and what we should actually be addressing. But overall, I would say I'm with the pro Woobat suspect people if that's what we want to do next.
Yeah, so we'll get into screens in a moment. I am definitely pro Woobat suspect. I haven't posted yet like I promised to. I think I'm going to cheat by just posting the podcast, but I've made these views clear. I think that Woobat being functionally synonymous with cheese, I don't really think that you would see it on any decent team that's not running webs or screens. And like you said, pretty core elements of both the Decay team and these like screens that we've seen from Serene and like Serene adjacent people. Here's my problem with Woobat, and here's why I think that it, over anything else, over Scraggy, Light Clay, is like broken in the traditional sense and should be suspected. I think that the counterplay for Woobat in any given game compared to any other like sweeper from screens or webs is going to be extremely frail and fragile. As you said, a lot of teams are relying on things like Onyx speed ties. I don't think that people are necessarily even comfortable relying on head smash Onyx to deal with Woobat, because there's a chance that you just lose a speed tie to timid Woobat and your check drops, which is obviously less than ideal. So with that in mind, you have a very narrow range of mons that have something that can actually do anything about Woobat. Scraggy can at least hypothetically eat a +2 Heat Wave, Dragon Dance, and Knockoff. That is a decent option, but it's not one people use because Scraggy isn't really used defensively on the teams that it's on. But it certainly works. Magnemite is everywhere right now as a result, I think, of Diglett not really being in the tier. Magnemite's very good, of course, at killing Woobat because it's so strong and it has that super effective Thunderbolt. Of course, the problem with Magnemite is you can lose Berry Juice Endure head games very easily, I think. And also, if you're Choice Scarf, you're good against screens usually, but you can't necessarily break through +2, +4 Woobat, especially behind screens, and also if you're against webs, you just lose. So obviously that's insufficient. The counterplay that we see most often is stuff like 19 speeders with T-Wave, especially Abra, since it can guarantee the T-Wave with Sash. Star U has also run T-Wave for this purpose. It is obviously more effective against screens than it is against webs. And I'm not really enamored with the idea that because we have all these T-Wave mons now that Woobat is dealt with in a sufficient way. People point to Woobat being like on the B part of the viability ranking, but not really dominating outside of these cheese setups. But what's clear to me is that the text that people are running pretty much explicitly for Woobat, so T-Wave, Stash, Abra. If you T-Wave a Woobat, you're still trading the Abra more than likely. Your Abra is going to die and something else needs to come in and kill Woobat. Encore Abra, obviously more effective in just denying right off the top because you can switch in and Encore on Calm Mind, at least if webs aren't up. But that's not, that again, Encore is going to be pretty insufficient. It's going to be definitely a minus in most matchups when you're not playing against cheese. And as we've seen in these circuit playoff games, especially in semis onward, there hasn't really been a lot of cheese brought in these games. Probably because people are worried about matchups, whatever else. Maybe they're not comfortable with the playstyles. But Encore Abra is a sacrifice that you have to make. That's just going to make you worse in other matchups. And people will say that that's a relatively minor sacrifice, but it also isn't really a guarantee against Woobat either. You're not going to 100-0 a Woobat just because your Abra has Encore. And of course, Abra against these cheese builds is going to be pressured quite a lot to deal with stuff like Scraggy. It's probably going to lose its Sash earlier in the game unless you play very well, so on and so forth. I think Woobat is just so narrowly checkable, and its checks can be dealt with in such ways that Woobat essentially pulls games back from the brink. Like, the Mon can win on its own if it gets in with grassy terrain up. We saw, I think it was the Serene Decay game, if you remember this one, in Snake Finals. You remember anything about that game?
Yeah, I think I remember DK being in, like, a dominant position, and everyone going, like, he's back, you know? Like, he's turned in a DK masterclass or whatever. And then kind of sort of letting it slip through his fingers, or sort of making like set assumptions that kind of weren't optimal for the situation, and then ending up getting turned out by Woobat, and then Woobat coming back from like 5-1. Chat was going crazy. Decay was obviously upset with himself. And then I remember in Little Cup World Cup Finals, I played Serene or whatever, and then I felt like I played better for most of the game, and then ended up in a late game Woobat situation, which I think I misplayed in the end. I did the calcs, and I should have hard switched and coughing to prevent it from calm minding. But it was a tough situation where Woobat can kind of like turn games around in the blink of an eye, and does it by design. It does it consistently, right? Like in the two games I've just mentioned, the people playing against the Woobat misplayed. But there are games where the entire setup is just conducive to Woobat winning at the end. So you don't have to chip that much. Maybe you just get the Abra Sash off. You weaken the Scraggy a little bit. And then suddenly you're in a position where your only recourse is to drain the grassy terrain. But they're going to force you down an alley where, to kill the Mon that comes before Woobat, you need to use the Mon that Woobat can immediately set up on. And there, they kind of like counterattack immediately. And like, you're against a Woobat that you basically can't touch, and that is going to kill you immediately. I think that sort of goes with both the argument for Woobat by itself and the argument as Woobat as maybe the symptom of the overall disease of these cheese teams, right? So like, T-Wave Abra works for Woobat. You'll stop it, you'll come to a Mon that can attack with dark type attacks, and they'll kill the Woobat after you've kind of slowed it down. But what happens after that? And you've gone from, you killed the Woobat with, say, Head Smash Onyx, and you've guaranteed it with the Thunder Wave. But then Scraggy comes in, and it's setting up. Or, I don't know, in the future, like, Shelder's coming in and setting up on these Pokemon. So...
Can you imagine?
Can I imagine? Yes. I mean, I think part of the problem when you talk about these setups is that immediately everyone goes to, like, the optimal setup that they see in front of them at that very moment. So you look at, like, the Serene Screens, which is an unfortunate name, setup, and you think, well, these are the only 6 months that'll work. Or you look at kind of like the Decayed Taz webs from Snake, and you're like, well, we've kind of figured that out, and that's kind of dropped in viability. So, like, webs will never be good again in Little Cup after spending all of Gen 6, all of Gen 7, and then a major team tour in Gen 8. Being, like, not only viable, but very, very good and able to determine matchups off Team Preview. These are sort of techniques. These are team structures that are adaptable. They shift with the metagame. They exploit weaknesses in the metagame, and that kind of, like, build in its narrowly prescribed set of counters. So basically, to beat a Woobat team, as they're currently constructed, not only do you have to beat the Woobat, you have to beat what comes in after the Woobat, and then you have to beat what comes out after that or whatever. And it's the screens and the web structures that are designed to prevent sort of narrow or softer checks from actually doing that work. So most of the time in LC, you're like, I have a Grookey, I have a Timber, maybe I don't check everything 100% of the time, but I know if I apply offensive pressure, if I get my rocks out, if I get my chips going, if I kind of make things take damage, then I'll be able to deal with it in the end. But the point of what the chase teams do is they force you into the hard counters immediately. So you have to be able to stop Scraggy cold in the tracks. You have to be able to stop Woobat cold in the tracks. And by kind of like forcing it into a situation where you have to burn your Abra to beat the Woobat, but then Scraggy comes in after, it sort of forces like these irresolvable pressures, not only like in game, which kind of redounds back to the builder. And if you were actually going to be secure against cheese teams in like every, or Woobat in particular, in every single team setup, you can't really use the bulk of the team structures that are available to you. You can't use something like, I don't know, a Ferroseed Fungus, because that just gets like ripped up by the common Woobat teams or the common Woobat structures. So, especially with Timber in the metagame more now, like that's just setup bait. It's getting 2+ defense. It's over.
Yeah, Timber just gets launched.
Yeah. So if we're in that situation where actually going out to check Woobat and not kind of like relying on the other guy not bringing it, or bringing kind of like a team that doesn't use it optimally, if you actually set out to be safe against Woobat and the teams it's kind of found on, you'll have limited the metagame in ways that we kind of don't expect it to be or want it to be.
So I guess to partially, can you headphones in? I got an echo. So I think that Woobat is kind of uniquely constraining on dealing with these teams. I don't really like playing against cheese. I'm not sure anybody does. There are probably a few contrarians out there, but by and large, kind of a rote experience. But I think Woobat forces this issue that you're talking about of breaking through these hard counters immediately much more fiercely than anything else does. So for example, if you're playing against webs and you have the Grookey Timber setup that you described, which I think Taz likes a lot, you have priority that deals pretty well with a whole slew of webs threats that you're going to see. Like, even if you're facing Nasty Plot Vullaby, if you have Fake Out Grookey, for example, you can chip down that Mon and you can make it less of a threat. You can deal with Tyrant to an extent. You can deal with Scraggy to an extent with that pair of Mons that sort of blanket check all kinds of sweepers. Woobat has the advantage of being resistant to both of those common types of priority, which should not be sneezed at. This is a very good defensive typing for a Mon that's never going to get knocked with its item. at least in any situation where it's relevant. If your Woobat is in and grassy terrain is not up, obviously it's garbage. But we're talking about a metagame where all of the dark types are going to be running weaker knockoff against your defense boosted itemless Mon. And also the common priority is going to be grass and fighting type. So you build in a Grookey resist to these teams. Grookey is setup bait for Woobat, which is insane for such a strong Mon. It's just true. Timber is setup bait. These blanket checks that help you deal with the other parts of Cheese obviously don't work against Woobat, which leads to these cascade effects where you're forced to bring in Abra, forced to bring in Magnemite, whatever else, forced to go coughing. I think Woobat is a unique stressor in that fact, and that's why if we were to suspect now, I would almost certainly vote to ban it. I just think that the elements of balance that you can reasonably put on a team that isn't Cheese, that aren't hard counters to Woobat alone, they just don't work against Woobat. Woobat overpowers them. Woobat can pull any game back from the brink because it's easy for it to eat a bunch of chip and not care. It's not going to take a lot from Mienfoo Fake Out. It's not going to take a lot from Mach Punch. It's not going to take a lot from Grassy Glide. It's just too easy to steamroll with that Mon. And that's why I think it's a unique problem with the Cheese archetype. And I think that Cheese has places to go after Woobat. I think we'll see more Magby. We'll see Nasty Plot Vullaby make a return. And those teams might still be annoying. I think if it proves that this archetype is still problematic down the line, then maybe we look at it again. Maybe we look at Light Clay or Natu. I'm not really sure what the ideal policy solution there is. I'm not really sure what the best fix would be at that point. But I think moving first on Woobat makes sense, and I think it's possible that this fixes a lot of the problems with how powerful screens are. Because, frankly, when we're talking about screens right now, web's less prominent, but webs are still significant. But talking about screens in specific, this is not really even a matchup fish at this point. This is a very reliably performing team archetype. It's not really easy to keep these teams from setting up. You could do things like run fast Mienfoo with Taunt. You can force out Natu, but they've developed all these setups to guarantee rocks, get Natu safely in, whatever and ever. But I think dealing with Woobat helps. So, to move a little bit on from that topic, with keeping in mind that you are pro Woobat suspect, but you don't necessarily think the best solution is that, what would you do? What are you advocating right now as the means of fixing this quote-unquote problem with Cheese?
Well, I think part of the problem is that I don't have like a specific prescription, like one thing to ban, because I'm obviously not a tier leader. I'm not an LC mod. I'm not like a person in the know about like what senior staff would tolerate or what kind of like best practices would be. But my argument and kind of my defense for my position has always been more conceptual, and I've kind of been irritated when trying to talk about this in the LC Discord, that no defenses of screens or webs proceed on the level of the concept, right? So like I'll try to say like, you know, these teams are kind of like intensely limiting if you take them seriously in the team builder. They're kind of generative and multiple in the way that they can kind of plug in different monsters, respond to different circumstances or whatever. They've kind of consistently proven themselves a problem. Even when kind of like one specific team fades, then we always end up running into a problem later in the metagame with a kind of like similar archetype. And it's something that like we don't enjoy playing against. It doesn't result in fun or interesting games for spectators or for the people playing in it if you're like unfortunate enough to be caught on the other side of one of these games. And people always respond to me and say, well, you can't ban Cheese. You can't do it. It's simply like a thing that should be illegal to do, is to ban Cheese. And I'm like, is someone going to make the affirmative case for why this makes the metagame better? Is it going to make a case that this isn't even a problem, or this is something that like that actually like increases creativity in the builder, or increases kind of like the level of thought and attention you need to put into like actually playing the game? Because the fact that no one actually does any of those things is pretty aggravating, and they kind of lean on the defense that like You know, like, it would just be too weird to ban Light Clay. Or, like, are you really going to ban, I don't know, Natu? Are you going to ban Woobat? Just kind of depending on the fact that these are kind of unimposing Pokemon kind of on their own, to avoid or sidestep the topic of the fact this actually has a deleterious presence on the metagame. I've sort of stated my argument kind of in the process there. It's basically like, this makes the metagame worse in building, this makes the metagame worse to play. I don't have a specific remedy, like whether it be Natu, whether it be Light Clay, whether it be the moves themselves. I'm not married to that solution, but like anything that reduces the prevalence or the prominence of them, particularly in like the highest level tour play, would be something that I support. Which isn't really an answer to the question, but it's like a good approximation of my thinking.
So what do you say to the people who say that it's a subjective stance, that dealing with cheese isn't fun? But Shrug, I love playing against screens. I love it when the Drober light clays me, or light ball, whatever the fuck. How do you deal with people who are going to say that you're making an argument ultimately on like subjective grounds of what an ideal game looks like?
Well, I think that kind of like misunderstands the term subjective, and it kind of attempts to get it to mean a specific thing in the Pokemon context, right? But like when we talk about something being over-centralizing or too powerful, then those are not we're not using objective metrics to get to those terms. We're not kind of like, we're not taking usage stats as kind of the only barometer. We're sort of like subjectively assessing what it does to the metagame. And I think kind of what I'm also doing is taking that same process for kind of team building and kind of in-game deliberation and kind of like the level of strategic thinking and adapting to the opponent that you need to do, both kind of like when you're constructing a team and when you're actually using it in practice. And then I'm saying like it does have a meaningful effect on those. So kind of like the flowchart or sequential nature of these teams does really kind of have a reductive impact on the type and amount of thinking you need to do in the games, and it more shifts them to kind of like, I know kind of coin flips are inevitable in a game like this, but it makes them kind of like core to the game in a way that even in other circumstances it's mostly like an unfortunate byproduct. So maybe when I use terms like or enjoy or whatever, that is too subjective, but I think using my personal feelings or verdicts in that way is kind of an attempt to make generalizable or understandable my feeling that it's kind of like these sort of semi-subjective but also kind of intellectually intelligible and notable factors of the way the game gets played, and kind of like relate it to everyone. So like, maybe if you're not like, maybe you haven't done as much thinking about like the flowchart nature of the screen seems, right? But you know how annoyed you are when you see one of those on the ladder. Like more so annoyed when you see like a quote unquote normal team, right? And like the post that caught me that infraction was kind of speaking to a common feeling of aggravation that I think would be a mistake to just kind of like ignore, because while the feeling itself may not be the grounds for action, the kind of intellectual underpinnings of that feeling are something that we should think about and take seriously, and that do kind of like fit into what we think of as acceptable tiering policy and practice.
I love that we've returned to the higher purpose of posting. I was really hoping that we would get a defense second week in a row, and we did. There we go. I think that just about covers it. I don't think there's a silver bullet solution for that either. But the question is, will you be able to get more people on board with that kind of tiering philosophy? But moving on from that, I'm moving to an adjacent issue, one that's definitely adjacent to Woobat, and the other Pokemon that we're hearing a bit of chatter about in terms of a suspect, it's Grookey. Grookey has been discussed quite a bit before this. I think we all know what kind of impact Grookey has in the team builder, in terms of the Mons that we're not seeing. Obviously, all of these water rocks that came back to us feel pretty bad as long as there's an extremely strong grass-type offensive Mon floating around. And then, of course, people associate Grookey with popping Grassy Seed. Do you ban Grookey or Woobat if you think Woobat is broken with Seed alone? I don't really want to get into that kind of policy nerd stuff. I think you obviously ban Woobat, but that's a separate issue. So, what do you think about the idea of a Grookey suspect, Grookey's impact on the metagame, and how it functions as just probably the most powerful new Pokemon we've seen in a long time in this tier?
Yeah, so I understand the desire for a Grookey suspect. It's obviously kind of like influenced the metagame a lot. It's kind of warped the way, like the introduction of a grass type priority. Like people have made the comparison to Fletchling. I think it's apt. It's even more powerful. It can hold items. It's just a stronger Mon in general. But like the ability to kind of attack fast and kind of bypass that speed interaction with such power and with such like a relevant type is kind of like a really unique thing in the tier. And I understand why kind of people find it too powerful. And my argument would be that a Grookey suspect currently would be too premature, and that we haven't fully examined kind of how the metagame should and will shift in response to the advent of different types of Grookey, or kind of like just the sheer fact of its presence in the metagame.
Yeah, absolutely. Different types of Grookey becoming more and more visible. We've seen a rather unfortunate Mega Kick miss, but Mega Kick Grookey's around to deal with coughing. We've seen a lot of U-turn, a lot of knock. There's all kinds of Grookeys out there.
Yeah, so I think that's all part of the process, right? So like you find new like suites of checks to Grookey that can also check everything else you need to check, and then Grookey kind of adapts to that to put pressure on those, and then you kind of reformulate it, which makes me think like we're going to have to cycle through that a couple times before we get like a full handle on like Grookey's full capacities, its best sets, its best single set, like what you should be spamming on teams or whatever, and kind of like the defensive cores that are required to stop it. To like have a full handle on it, where you feel like this team isn't Grookey weak, you can get to your attacks or whatever without worrying about it. So I think part of that process is going to be not only understanding what you have to do to defend against Grookey, but what the other person is leaving vulnerable in their team when they include Grookey in their lineup. So like, if you think about it, Grookey really can't or shouldn't switch into much. Maybe you can switch into Earthquakes, but like even kind of Onyx Rock moves you don't want to come into. You don't want to come into any of the water types because they always have coverage for you.
Even without the coverage, I think you take 60% from Analytic Hydro Pump from Staryu.
Yep. Or if you use the absolutely garbage Skull set, you're doing probably 18% damage, but you're burning 100% of the time. So
it evens out, really.
Yeah, it evens out. So, but the point is, like, if you have a Grookey on your team, you're essentially delegating your switching responsibilities to the other 5 Pokemon. And in doing that, you're often doubling up on weaknesses. So, like, if you're going to check Staryu, you probably want something like a Ferroseed. But, like, are you Vulpix weak then? So and are you Vullaby weak? So you're kind of prescribing yourself an Onyx? Are you kind of adding on a fighting type to that kind of just to address Pawniard? The weaknesses are kind of like systematic and predictable and exploitable with things that you would think are kind of like made worse by Grookey, but may indeed kind of still have a niche as kind of forcing Grookey into counter. So I think we talked in PMs about Life Orb Staryu. So like if you can get Life Orb Staryu in on the Onyx team or the Onyxes that kind of Grookey teams kind of like, then you're pressuring a Grookey team because of the fact that your grass type can't switch into Staryu, can't switch into the water type. And if you can build your team around something like a Staryu plus a Fungus, or maybe even a Pidoo or whatever, where you're kind of harding into the
There it
grassy
is.
glide.
There it
And you're-
is.
Yeah, Purdue Propaganda is back. I will be using him in the next Team Tour final that I am in. Managers, be forewarned. But you can see the appeal where it's like, if you get a Purdue in on a grassy glide, it's doing like 4.8%. You're getting that back with grassy terrain. You're setting spikes. You're setting off a sludge bomb. You're using sleep powder. You're kind of like making progress by forcing this Grookey into doing something that's like ultimately meaningless as a turn. So there are ways to exploit it. There are ways that's obviously very good. And I think we need to kind of watch the metagame find its natural balance around the Pokemon before we kind of leap into it hastily. But I don't think it's like an unreasonable position to think that this like might be broken now or could sustainably be broken even after we investigate all the options to counter it.
So I think that what you said about how new this is and the sort of process of call and response, I think all of that's very pertinent. Important to remember that this is probably a top 3 Pokemon in the metagame. I would say that, at least for myself, that we've had since about the end of June, if I recall correctly. Everything that's occurred after LCPL has had fully powered up Grookey with the training weights off. But that's it. That's the entire length of meta development that we've had with this Pokemon. And we've seen a lot of meta development around it. We've seen how much that Grookey has affected the defensive cores that people are willing to use. There was a moment in time where Mariani just ceased to exist. But then, of course, in the middle of LC World Cup, you see the rise of these Trapinch Mariani defensive cores to deal with Grookey. And of course, Mariani helps deal with how good Timber became in a Fungus meta. We're still in that process of call and response, because you see Protect Grookey even. You see even teams without Trapinch running Mariani. You see these Grookeys that don't even run fighting coverage, at which point Ponyard becomes a check, and I think we've seen a bit more Ponyard than usual. I just think it's fascinating to watch all of these changes to the metagame caused by this one Pokemon, and I would agree that we're not nearly at a point of stasis yet. People are still figuring out what to do here. People are dealing with the fact that Diglett is less prominent than it probably ever has been. This is the least Diglett that we've seen in a long time, which has this dual effect where people are building as if the bond doesn't exist. We saw 2 Kanto Ponytas in the Taz Lily LTPL game that happened just about in the last hour before we're recording this. We're seeing a lot of these Abras to check stuff. It's almost a trade-off where the mons that people are afraid to run because of Grookey trade off with the mons that people were originally afraid to run because of Diglett, and those things are just back in full force. Magnemite, for example. And I would certainly agree that even the stuff that Grookey seems to make worse, like Offensive Staryu, Mudbray, for example, just because those things struggle with Grookey doesn't mean that the cascade effect of how those teams deal with those Pokemon defensively, it doesn't mean that they can deal with it well. So like Offensive Staryu, the Life Orb Staryu that we mentioned, unless you're running Double Grass, and even then you're just Ferroseed Grookey, for example, you're probably going to have a hard time with an Offensive Staryu set with the right coverage. Or maybe your Mudbray switching just isn't that reliable on a Grookey team, where you're forced to bring in a Vullaby and get rock slided or whatever else. People are still figuring out what this Pokemon does, and I think that unlike Woobat, unlike even Vullaby, I think there's a lot of decent to solid counterplay to Grookey. Definitely Grookey has ways around things like Fungus and Coughing, and even Vullaby in theory, with stuff like Mega Kick, stuff like Acrobatics, which is a set that we don't really see as much anymore. But because the mon can only do so many things at so many times, and because its checks are such a natural part of the metagame, like you're almost certainly going to have a Vullaby, you're probably going to have something like a Ponyard, you're probably going to have a Coughing or a Fungus. All of that stuff is just around. And it's aided by the fact that Grass is such a mediocre offensive type that I think that there isn't really a rationale to suspect the Pokemon right now. I think it's checked sufficiently with what we have, and I don't think we know necessarily what the metagame looks like in a settled state with Grookey in it. So I think by and large I agree with you there, but I imagine we're going to hear a lot of noise continually about Grookey, especially if we don't get a Woobat suspect right away.
I would just say to the people who want to suspect Grookey right now, like, do you really believe that the end state of an LC metagame with Grookey in it is that Diglett will appear, like, in 1% of games or whatever it is now? Like, is there going to be a metagame where Diglett, the Pokemon that everyone has wanted to suspect in this tier since kind of I've joined the tier, has wanted gone or whatever, is going to be completely unviable? I think we can still find ways where, like, Mons we thought were banished by Grookey come back, and then, like you said, kind of like Mons we thought Diglett made bad are kind of like back in the metagame now, but they'll kind of find a more natural level. And once that happens and I've become sufficiently convinced that we've kind of reached the end of the rope with Grookey metagame development, then we can obviously take a look then. But for now, I would kind of advise caution. And I'm with you in that, like, we should be prioritizing something like the bat or other stuff before we kind of go too early on this Pokemon that has really changed the metagame.
Yeah, I think Grookey's super cool. I'm on the record, and I talk incessantly about this. I probably mentioned it last time, but boo-hoo, we're going to talk about it again. I put a bet, just pride, but a bet nonetheless, on Grookey getting suspected. So, at least for my spirit, it would be great if Grookey got suspected. But I don't think it's the right policy move at this point in time, and I think we have time to figure out if we should go in that direction.
I want to shout out Plasmagby, because the day whatever this gen came out was, he and I PM'd for like half an hour about how cool Grookey was going to be when he got the grassy terrain ability, whatever it's called. And we've been proven right. Every day, our Grookey predictions come more and more to fruition. We originally planned on banned Grookey. That didn't quite come off. I think I could still try to make it work for the sake of my pride. But overall, good prediction. Shout out Plaz, the most underappreciated builder of Gen 7 LC.
I want to shout out Plasmagby because he's Plasmagby. I don't really have any opinion on his Grookey takes, although they're correct. But he is Plasmagby, and that's worthy of respect. I do remember very vividly a game in probably the first 24 hours of this SS metagame where you O-code my Vullaby with Choice Band Woodhammer back when we didn't know that terrain was 1.3 instead of 1.5. So the energy's been out there for Grookey to come alive. And he's here, and he's spectacular. Just to wrap up, in terms of significant LC we got happening, still the quiet season, but we should be within the next 24 hours before the deadline, we have circuit finals between Bullycroc and Kither. A couple of interesting faces. Bullycroc has been pretty much everywhere in these seasonals. He's just been in the finals what feels like every other tour. He lost to Z-Strats in the finals of Swiss, I believe. Majors. And Kither, exciting new face. I think a likely I'm drawing a blank on what the important trophy tour we're still in is, but I think a likely pick for that kind of tour. And the up-and-coming star. So very interesting matchup. Who you got?
Who do I have? Well, it's kind of difficult to predict, but I've seen Bullycroc play for longer. He did end my backdoor run into LC Circuit playoffs by landing a grassy terrain crit with Fungus Giga Drain on my Swords Dance Mienfoo. But I bear no resentment.
Mad, though. He's not mad.
I'm not mad. I'm actually laughing. It's funny to me that I didn't make the tournament because of this crit. It's actually cool, but I bear no resentment. I think Bull is going to win. I think I was more persuaded by his play in the semifinals, where kind of Kither benefited from, in both his wins, kind of like actively unfortunate things happen to Lily AC, whereas in the Bully game, I don't really I'm not taking data either way, because it sort of seemed like Taz grievously haxed him, and then Bully Croak, in response to that, even more grievously haxed him to go from a losing position to a winning position. But based on his consistency throughout the season, I think he's who I'm picking to finally dethrone Osh and take the ribbon.
Yeah, I think it just about sums it up. Back-to-back win posts from last Sunday. We got Kithir saying, "I did not deserve game 1. I'm very sorry." And Bully Croc saying, "1 versus Taz in a Haxie set." I think that puts it lightly in both cases, but I would agree. Bully was more convincing in his couple of wins. There was a lot of misfortune in the Lily AC series that really reminds us that this game was not designed to be played competitively, and maybe it just shouldn't. Maybe we should quit altogether. Who's to say? But nonetheless, lack of bitterness on our part aside, very impressive run by both of these players to add on to very impressive years. And beyond that, we've got LTPL. I don't know if you've been following that. I really haven't.
I've not.
So,
no.
maybe you, the viewer, are, but we're not going to tell you about it because, frankly, who cares? If that's bad politics for me to say that, then I take it back. It was a joke, and I don't mean it. But best of luck to those LCers still active in LTPL. I don't remember if we still have a semis game to go. We might not. Who knows? But
isn't Gummy managing in that tournament?
Gummy is assistant
didn't
manager.
Gummy and
TKO.
Tico didn't they make the playoffs or whatever?
You know, I have frankly no idea. I didn't even know who their LCer is. I think that the LCers still in that tour are Taz, Lily, and I don't even know who else. I mean, we know who got drafted to play LC in that tour. Kind of a smorgasbord of just whoever, like people who walked through the room at the right time. But
all the hitters: Grizz, Zeraloa, Chex Luther.
Yes,
it's happening again.
Finally, people recognize the back end of my top 10 PR for SSLCers. They're getting drafted. The recognition is there, and baby, the season of victory is upon us. But
I think we need a Discord mains Premier League where we force like Nodley and Esk to play a best of 5 with live Twitch commentary.
I think that Nodley would destroy him on account of Nodley got Rex and knows that what Grookbat is probably.
No. I feel like if we got Esk into like a 2-hour intensive training session, I feel like his Wikipedia knowledge assimilation would kind of kick in. And he would immediately be like, all right, like, Timber has a good matchup against Fungus teams or whatever. But if it's a Mare team, I need to rely on kind of like my Ponyji Grookey core. I feel like a training montage scene with like me and Luthier kind of just intensively putting him through his paces in SSLC, I would favor him. But like, Nodley's a respectable choice.
I think that the idea of a Rocky montage, but instead of somebody running up a bunch of steps or punching somebody in the head, they're just sitting at a computer and clicking every once in a while. I think that's cinematic gold, and I think we're going to make that eventually.
Instead of like a smoothie with raw eggs in it, he's drinking just like soy.
So like straight Soylent mixed with like Bang energy drink. Don't even know what that tastes like, but I've been advertised it prolifically.
No, Aunt Jeezy is going over to his house with like 4 white monsters of different flavors.
I think White Monster is the flavor, dude. Esk sitting there just clicking. Ant's not even playing; he's just crushing like 8 cans of White Monster. That's the montage we're offering
in the background. Yeah, I think we could sell this pilot. I think we need to get this down. We need to get this in like Google Docs, get a script going.
The Hollywood elite are going to tell us no. I can feel it. But while we gear up for that rejection, thank you to everybody for tuning in to episode 2 out of 2 of the LC podcast, and let's ban this bat. Good night.
All right, everyone, stream the Memphis Goons. Follow Chrissy Teigen for some good ass tweets, and Stan Alan Dershowitz.
I disavow.